Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think we're ready to start. We at least have about 31 participants that have joined in the call. So in view of time, we'll start because there's a lot to discuss on this webinar. So I'd like to welcome everyone to today's webinar. Today's webinar is specifically unpacking the issue of Etims that was brought up by KRA. So in this webinar, we hope to understand more on what are our requirements as doctors, as even locum doctors. What are the ways of trying to even claim back our taxes after you've remitted or uploaded the invoices on the Etims platform, and how to be integrated into the Etims. So with us, we have Beatrice Jerry, who is from Tara Agility Africa. She's an expert in taxation and also an accounting expert as well. She has over 12 years of experience in financial management, but over the years, she's had more time spent in tax efficient strategies, where she aims to optimize the tax positions and enhance profit extraction. Sorry, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Dr. Rachel Kimani, the treasurer for KSA. And I'd like to hand over to Beatrice at this point. But before I do that, a bit of housekeeping issues. Kindly stay muted. Should you have any question, put it in the chat box. We'll have a Q&A at the end, which will be about 10-15 minutes, depending on the amount of questions that we have for her. Otherwise, Beatrice, welcome.
Thank you, Rachel. Good evening, everyone. And thank you for joining us today for this webinar. My name is Beatrice Njeri. I'm the tax compliance and accounting partner at Tara Agility. So at Tara Agility, we basically provide legal and tax and accounting support to businesses. So beginning from setup of businesses, licensing, performing due diligence for M&A transactions. We also support with employment. I'm sorry. We also assist our clients with tax compliance and reporting, ensuring that you do your taxes properly, you have the right obligations, and we'll also assist you with bookkeeping, including seconding staff for you who will assist you on a day-to-day basis. Also, we do outsourced payroll and compliance, basically complying with all the payroll requirements, including filing, keeping your payroll records in order. And today, I'm happy to be here to discuss the Etims regulation that came about from the Finance Act of 2023. So you'll remember there was KRA. Initially, there was the ETR devices that used to be used for recording sales. This was upgraded to a tax invoice management system in 2021, which was fully rolled out in 2022. So this basically involved upgrading the ETR devices to accommodate for them to have internet, and then for your invoices to be able to be transmitted on a real time to KRA. So after the rollout of the teams, KRA saw it beneficial to them to ensure that they are getting enough information on revenue that is being made out there. So they introduced the Etims, which is the electronic tax invoice management system that would then include everybody, including those who are not VAT registered. So this was for all resident businesses, VAT and non-VAT registered. This was announced in 2023, September. And the deadline was initially 31st December to onboard to Etims. But the fact remains from 1st January 2024, all invoices should be transmitted on Etims for them to be tax deductible at the end of the year. The deadline has since been moved to 31st March, so it's still fast approaching. And I'll share my presentation on I hope you can see my screen. So what does Etims mean for medical practitioners and local doctors? So today we are going to cover the onboarding process for Etims, the solutions that are available for you to manage your invoicing, including integration of your system to Etims. I'll also talk about the exemptions and penalties for non-compliance. We'll also touch a bit on how to manage the invoices on Etims. And also, due to requests from some of you, we'll talk about the withholding tax versus pay as you earn for local doctors, and also touch on the VAT on medical services. So by definition, Etims is a software-based solution that facilitates the generation and transmission of invoices through the KRA portal. You can either use the KRA portal or integrate the invoicing system to your existing ERP. This can basically be operated on your usual hardwares, that being the mobile phones or a smartphone or a computer. So what happens when invoices are transmitted on Etims? They are automatically reflected on KRA database, and this will allow for auto-reconciliation of both your income and your expenses at the end of the year. So these are talked about the key changes. So currently the 31st March 2024 is the date to look out for, because then the onboarding process will be due by then. Even if the 31st deadline is there, note that for all invoices that you've done from January to the date you will onboard, will need to manually be input onto Etims for them to qualify for deductibility for tax purposes at the end of the year. So there's still something to be done even when you're on board late. The onboarding process involves the Etims has a portal. So basically, you're required to go onto the portal and input your PIN. Then a message will be sent to your registered number, and then you're able to log in. But then you need to submit the required documentation for it to be approved. This documentation includes the ID or passport of the director for that company, or the owner or a legal representative for the company. Note that this director should be, or the company representative should be listed on your iTax details, because the same data that is on iTax is migrated to Etims. So you'll also need to provide a company CR12 to show the ownership, and an application letter to KRA indicating that you're applying for you to be onboarded to Etims. And then the other one is a commitment form that will be downloaded from KRA website. Then you fill in the details of the company, including the contact number, the same numbers that were on iTax, and an email address, and the director details, the same details that were on iTax. The reason I'm insisting on that is if these details do not match, then the application will not be approved. So there are several solutions. Once you onboard, there are several solutions for your invoicing that you can adapt. And for you to know which solution, you need to know the nature of your business. Is it a service? For all of you, I believe, would be services. How many invoices are you doing in a month? What access do you have to? Is it a laptop? Is it a smartphone? And good internet connection, because everything will be live online. So of the solutions that are there, there's a Etims portal. This is for services only, which would be a good solution for the members here. So the Etims portal would involve, you'll just need to log into the Etims portal, and then you're able to feed in the details of your services, and then you're able to invoice directly from the portal. This is a free solution that comes in the Etims. The other one is Etims Lite, which is for VAT who are offering services only. Then there's the Etims PayPoint Windows and multi-point. And there's also the Android, the phone, the smartphone option, and also the VSU. This is where you integrate your system with the Etims. For example, if you have already an existing invoice management system or an accounting software, then there's a way to integrate Etims onto your existing system through the KRA approved third-party providers for these APIs. One of them being Digitax, who we are working with, so they can assist you with integrating your system with Etims, and you can directly use the platform on Digitax, or still continue using your existing system, and the invoices you produce will be Etims compliant. That is basically all about the integration. So there are exemptions to Etims, which include emoluments, this being salaries and wages. So these ones are exempt. You do not need to input salaries and wages on Etims. This basically being because there's already pay as you earn that has been paid on them, and KRA would be able to reconcile this quite easily from their end. Also imports, believing their documentation for that. Investment allowances, interest, airline tickets, fees by financial institution, bank charges and all that. Expenses subject to withholding tax as a final tax. For example, interest from savings with a bank. Also supplies by people below 5 million shillings. So if your business is below 5 million, you're not obliged to onboard to Etims. But nonetheless, I believe for a commercial, from a commercial perspective, the fact that for the expenses to be deductible for tax purposes, they will require to be on Etims. I believe most companies, especially big corporates, will require you to be on Etims for them to not have to explain that some of their suppliers are below 5 million, which would then maybe require you to have an audited financial account for them to prove that you're indeed below the 5 million mark. So that's it about the exemptions. So what happens if you're not compliant? So if you fail to comply with the regulations or do anything against the recommended procedure, then you're liable to 100,000 fine. And also note that for all expenses that do not go through Etims, then you'll not be able to claim them for tax purposes. that essentially means you'll pay tax on that expenditure. This is important because if you're running a business or if you have other income that will need you to have expenses to reduce your tax obligation, it means you need to ensure that all your suppliers are also onboarded to Etims to ensure that you don't lose out on claiming the expenses and end up paying tax on that. So I'll go straight to how you manage your invoices. So it's a requirement that all the sales that you do should be done on Etims. That means even if you're not VAT registered, there's an option for non-VAT transactions. Others will go to 16%, zero rated, or an exempt supply. So that's to note that all your invoices should go through Etims. The good thing with Etims is that you're able to get a report of all your sales, which you can also print out in periodical time. You can do a monthly report, a quarterly report, or even a yearly report to see what you've done for that period. Especially if you're using the third party, which are more detailed, you're able to see even the purchases from people who are your suppliers, because they will have taken your PIN and generated Etims invoices on their end, and the same will be reflected on KRA and now on this system that you're able to monitor. So what happens if you do an error? You have an error on your invoices. You're required to generate a credit note so that you cancel that transaction and raise the correct one. You can also do a partial one. It doesn't have to be the full amount, depending on what amount is wrong. You can still do a partial cancellation of the wrong amount. So there are basic things that you should include on an invoice, including the buyer's PIN for them to be able to claim, and also capture the names correctly of the buyer for you to be able for it to benefit the person who is buying from you or who you're providing the services to. The next topic was there's a question about locum doctors being asked to have their pays brought together with the other salary and deducted pay from that those earnings. Pay or pay as you earn is basically for permanent employees or employees that are on a monthly contract or employed on a monthly basis. These will be essentially primary employees whose pay rates would be 10% to 35%, depending on the level of the salary. If you're to be treated as a secondary employee, that means your pay would be at either 35% or 30%, depending on how much in total you're earning in that month. On the other hand, withholding tax is advanced tax on professional fees and also for contractual purposes, contractors who do buildings and all those things. So you're not expected to be a consultant for every month. It might raise a red flag on KRA side if you're consistently being paid a consultancy fee by your employer on a monthly basis. What KRA views that as is you're either dodging to do the other statutory requirements, including providing leave days for that person, or you want to reduce the tax, because if they only have 5%, it doesn't mean they're guaranteed to have the final 25 or 35. What you need to note with withholding tax is that it's not final tax for your purpose. What happens is what is deducted as 5% will be available for you as a credit at the end of the year for you to claim as tax already paid on your income. Your income being the profit on your earnings. So that would mean your income minus your expenses for the business that you're working, you're generating that income from. So what do you do to ensure that you remain in the consultancy position and avoid the compulsory secondary employee status? You can either invoice on a project basis, so you have smaller invoices for all the transactions that you do. You can space out you can ensure that the contract between you and your contractor has a way to space out invoicing, not to be done every month, but maybe every 2-3 months or even more months. Or you can even have registered businesses that will be used to contract on those consultancy works. And by that, the company will be paid directly. And the fact that it's a company being paid, then it will not be subject to pay as you earn. The other issue was on VAT, who is eligible for VAT and who is not. So as a medical practitioner, given that you're providing services, these services are subject to VAT. And if the total revenue that you earn from that consultancy business, as we would call it, then you meant if the total revenue is above the 5 million per year, then you should register for VAT. If you're supplying medical supplies, the first schedule of the VAT Act has a list of medical supplies that are exempt from VAT. And also the second schedule has some that are zero rated for VAT purposes. So that's the position on VAT. And I think from there, I'll welcome questions. In case there's anybody with a question, I'll look at
Thank you, Beatrice, for your presentation. I can see we have 2 questions in the chat box. So the first question is, in our case, can a practice license from the medical council work when you're registering for Etims? That's question 1. Question 2, do payments made by credit card qualify for tax deduction, e.g., if you pay for fuel or car service, etc.? Then the third question is, explain VAT exemption versus zero rating. I think you can tackle those first 3 as we wait for another stream of questions.
Okay. So I'm assuming the practicing certificate or license is being used in the place for a CR12. Maybe they can come out clearly. But if you're an individual, the requirements would be your ID card, basically, because you're not a company, then the CR12 will not apply. Do payments made by credit card qualify for tax deduction? That would be fuel, car service. So even if you're making a payment by a credit card, it means there's an invoice to it. So it's up to you to go to the provider, either the petrol station, give them your PIN and let them give you an Etims compliant invoice. Otherwise, payments only will not qualify for tax deduction. if they are not being supported by Etims compliant invoices. Explain VAT exemption and zero rating. So VAT exemption, it means that supply is not vatable, and consequently, any purchases that are related to generating that income on that exempted service will also not be deductible for VAT purposes. Zero rating means it's vatable, only that it's at 0%. So it's still considered, it takes the full, it enjoys the full deduction for VAT purposes, but the service will basically be zero rated. So no VAT is due on that.
Thank you for the clarification. I have a question.
Yes.
Like for us doctors, when you have things like conferences or you've gone for an international or basically maybe a local conference, are we able to claim that as an expense? Because
if it's
most
local,
sorry, you can go ahead.
Yeah, if it's a local conference, then that conference center should give you an invoice that it is compliant. If it is international, that falls under imports. So it's exempted from Etims, and you still be able to deduct it for tax purposes.
Just to give you a breakdown, like when we do the local one, we use through the society. My members pay the registration for the conference through the society. And yes, the society now goes ahead and pays for the accommodation or for the conference facilities to the hotel. So the society gets the tax receipt. But now what happens to the member who's paid, for instance, maybe 25,000 to attend the conference?
Yeah, so the society is the one that is invoicing you. So the society is also not exempt from Etims. I had seen a hand from Paul. Paul, you want to say something?
Yeah, absolutely. This is Paul Mutegi. So I think just for some context, and Beatrice, you're absolutely right. Actually last year we were able to defend two doctors who had basically received tax demands from the Revenue Authority, where the Revenue Authority was specifically saying that conference fees and charges are not tax deductible. We were able to successfully defend those two doctors and actually give a very strong position that indeed those conference expenses are tax deductible. In fact, for one of the doctors, the KRA was even challenging the deductibility of air tickets, accommodation, etc., where this doctor had actually gone to the UK for conferences and for further training. Now, in terms of deductibility of expenses, the first position that is given under the Income Tax Act is that the expense needs to be incurred wholly and exclusively in the production of business income. And as long as that test is met, then the expense becomes deductible. The question about Etims is now new, and it's an administrative issue. Right? Basically, that not only do you need to meet the first test, where the expense is incurred wholly and exclusively for business purposes and in the production of business income, but now Etims is now a layer on top of that, right? So the first test needs to be met, then the second test is the Etims test. I think that's my first comment. I think the second comment is on this question about locum. I think KRA are getting it wrong. And the reason I say that is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but how I understand locum is that, I'm employed by Nairobi Hospital. but for a few hours a week, I go to Aga Khan, right? And I'm paid for a certain time that I'm there, etc., right? In my view, my engagement with Aga Khan is not an employment engagement, because there's a specific difference between who a contractor is and who an employee is. It's a legal definition, really. An employee is an employee, meaning you get leave days, you get tools of trade, you're basically integrated into the business, you have a company email, that kind of thing. There's a list of almost 7 or 8 items that one needs to fulfill to sit under employee as opposed to contractor. Now, if you sit under contractor, if you don't fulfill these obligations, and British, I think we can share this after the call, essentially you're a contractor. And if you're a contractor, it means the income you earn is business income, and the taxation of business income is distinctly different from the taxation of employment income. The taxation of business income requires that expenses are deducted from your income, and it is only the profit thereafter that is then subjected to tax, right? So as a contractor, you must be allowed to expense any costs that you have incurred in the generation of that business income, right? So you can see it's very distinct. Those two things are very distinct from each other. And by KRA trying to say that this income should be put under employment income, it actually offends that legal principle of the difference between a contractor and an employee, because it would then mean that you're an employee, meaning even in terms of, for legal reasons, you can then sue Aga Khan, in the example I gave you, for not giving you leave days, which doesn't make sense because you're not an employee, right? So I think there's some work to be done there in terms of that thinking. In my opinion, based on what I know so far, is that it may be the case that actually that income is actually contractual income subject to withholding tax as an advance tax, and thereafter on the profit, if any, you would pay as you earn. Yeah, so I think that demarcation needs to be made quite clearly. Now, I think on the point of the 5 million, the threshold of 5 million as an exemption threshold, there's what the law says, and then there is what is going to happen commercially, what we think is going to happen based on our experience. Now, as with other things like tax compliance certificates, which you generally be asked for during the onboarding process as a KYC document, what happens is that because the business that is engaging you has more bargaining power, right? They can then make a unilateral decision to say that we will only engage doctors who are on Etims, right? And if they do that, it would then mean that you would unnecessarily be disadvantaged if you're not on Etims, right? Because then what the hospital will be saying, we only want to deal with doctors who are on Etims, because if they bill us through Etims, we are able to expense that cost. And if we deal with a doctor who is not on Etims, we cannot expense that cost, meaning we pay further tax on it. So commercially, there's a decision to be made, and I think this is what we've also been explaining to other industries. There's a decision to be made as to, at the industry level, what to do. And in our view, based on our experience, we think that onboarding onto Etims may be the right thing to do, because then you don't want to be in a position where you're unnecessarily disadvantaged by virtue of this Etims issue. Beatrice?
Yes, I agree with you, Paul, totally. So I think it's up to, at an individual level to decide on what makes sense commercially for you. If you want to take full control of the market, you don't want to be left out, then it's only wise to be on Etims as opposed to not being on Etims? I think there's another question here asking, is it more advantageous to trade as a company and pay some salary to yourself and pay and get deductible expenses? Then you don't have to pay further income tax, or trading on an individual pin and have challenges with stealings and personal expenses. Yeah, I think you're trying to explain how a doctor can can get an optimal tax strategy by trading as a business or a company, so that the company is the one that manages the professional consultancy income. Upon submitting invoices to hospital where payment is done later or partially done or not paid at all, when is withholding tax due? So withholding tax is due when you're paid. So when they're making the payment to you, that is at that point that they should deduct the 5% and remit it to KRA within 5 days of paying you. This is an obligation for the person paying you and not you. So it's up to the hospital or the medical insurance to comply with this regulation to ensure that they do not attract penalties for either not deducting on time or not remitting the same by the 5 days period. The other question is, does it mean that for every expenditure one has to make payment against the Etims invoice? Yeah, I think basically this is how we're going to go about operations. So once you get an invoice, just ensure that the invoice has been generated through Etims or Teams. So this is an additional point that even companies that are still operating on Teams as opposed to Etims, the invoices are still eligible for tax deduction. This is because they are still being transmitted to KRA, and that means they are compliant with the e-invoicing. The use of invoices as evidence of income can be misleading, as some is not earned. This will really depend on how you've structured your business. Let's call it business, because this is separate from employment. So if you recognize your invoices as income, as invoices, especially if they're Etims invoices, then it automatically becomes income, because the KRA has already the information that you've made that business. What I see professionals doing is creating a pro forma invoice in the beginning, or a deposit request note, so that you do not consider it as your tax invoice or your final invoice, and then you raise an invoice against at the time you're paid. So that gives you time as to when you recognize the income.
Thank you. So does Etims allow you to have a pro forma invoice, then later on you come up and give a new invoice for the monies that have been paid at the point whereby you notice the withholding has been taken?
No. Anything that goes to Etims is directly reported on KRA side. So it's automatically an income once you transmit the same. So the pro forma invoice will be a side thing, like something you're doing on your manual management of your income.
Thank you. Anyone else with a question? Will previous unpaid invoices be affected?
Previously unpaid invoices. Oh, you mean for income that was invoices that were raised in 2023? I think for this one, they will not be affected because the enforcement is coming in from January 1st. So as long as you report them in 2023, then they will not be affected by the regulation for 1st January 2024.
I have another question, Beatrice. What happens in the case of, let's say I raised an invoice of probably maybe 20,000 and what eventually was paid was 15,000? How do you rectify that on Etims? Because companies have different cultures and different ways. Probably the patient negotiated or the insurance company negotiated.
Oh, that's where you raise a credit note for the difference to cancel that amount, the one that you've not received. Of course, with backup for any future scrutiny, for you to show that indeed the scope changed, or the final invoice was that less amount.
Thank you. Anyone else with a question before we wind up? All right. Thank you so much, Beatrice from Tara, for giving us. Oh, sorry, there's one more. Lee, are payers okay with pro forma invoices? Is it binding, legal, or legal for chasing debts?
Well, it depends with the payer, really. Some of them are okay, some are not. As to it being binding, I think I'll let Paul answer. If it's a legal document.
I think, and I didn't introduce myself. I'm Paul Mutegi. I'm the managing partner. But I think to answer that question, really the real issue here is it's a documentation issue. Do we have a legally binding contract that then makes the demand for payment due and payable, right? So the real question is not whether you send a deposit request note, an invoice, or a pro forma invoice, etc. The real question is, what is the legal documentation or the contract or agreement between, for instance, the insurance company and yourself, or the hospital and yourself, right? That is what really determines whether the amount is due and payable. So even if, let's say, you are to go to court seeking to receive these funds that you say are due to you, that's a question that will be asked. Not how you demanded for the funds, but whether there's a legally binding contract and whether you have dispensed your obligations as a service provider.
Thanks, Paul. I hope that's clear. There's another question. Are credit notes raised via Etims? Yes. So you need to raise the credit notes on Etims. And this requires you to match the invoice that you're crediting. The details need to be included so that it's matched to the invoice you're creating a credit note for. What is your experience as a service provider so far? With credit notes, I think it's working, and it doesn't need an approval, so it's pretty straightforward.
Okay, thank you once again, Beatrice, and the team from Tara. Thank you as well, Paul, for expounding on a few points here and there. There's a link. Should you have any more questions, you can direct them towards the team, towards Tara. So they've put their information on the chat box. Do have a look at it, and you can always reach out to them at any point. I hope this session was helpful, and at least we've gotten some insight or some at least information on how to navigate through Etims. So we're going to have a bit of housekeeping issues. I think the only housekeeping issue that we have, I don't know if Mbadi is around, and I think she's not around. So Audrey, could you project? So this is the only housekeeping issue. Just a reminder to kindly register in for our conference, which is going to be on the 14th and 16th of August. The early registration deadline is drawing near, which is on the 30th of April, sorry, this year. So kindly register, and let's all get geared towards having a successful conference this year. Otherwise, without any further ado, I'd like to thank everyone for attending this meeting and attending this webinar. Thank you for your inputs. Thank you for your time. And I wish everyone else a lovely evening, and take care of yourselves. Be blessed. Thank you. Goodbye. Good night.
Good night. Thank you, Rachel. And thanks, everyone.